Hi, this is Mark. In this video, I'm going to distinguish between Aspergers or high-functioning autism and ADHD or ADD. To start off, there's a lot of commonality among these disorders and overlap. This is attributed to the communication issues that are exhibited between autism and ADHD or ADD. And ADD, because of the hyperactivity component, or ADHD, the hyperactivity component in the attention deficit issues are involved, can kind of create problems or havoc in terms of the ability to communicate properly due to the lack of impulse control. So someone with ADD or ADHD, they have issues with regulating the impulse and the control, and this is because neurotypicals, or we could represent normality as like there's a neutral axis, and no one is exactly normal. We're neurotypical. We all have like a spectrum of traits that may not we may not reach the threshold to be diagnosed, but everyone has like a dose of narcissism or selfishness or whatnot, or you know problems with attention. There's always going to be issues, but if we just represent as like neurotypical relative to ADD or ADHD, they get a higher They don't need as much stimuli to receive a normal reward. Someone with ADHD or ADD, they have a much higher threshold for stimuli to achieve an equivalent reward. Therefore, they need to compensate and focus on heavy interest, and therefore there's a focal range. Basically, interests almost become narrow, and that's kind of where the commonality lies between Asperger's or autism and ADHD, because both tend to have hyper focus on key areas of interest. ADD and ADHD as a consequence of limited reward signaling, and usually someone with ADD and ADHD, they switch tasks very quickly, and this is because they thrive for that stimuli that is not typically received for menial or monotonous tasks, and their mind needs to be saturated with reward, and at a much higher degree, and therefore they need to switch, and typically switch between multiple interests over time, or they're always seem to be bouncing around. That's why we tend to call it like scatter-minded and scatterbrain, or we use the terminology, even though it's not exclusive for those. Exclusive for both those this ADD and ADHD. The problem, though, to distinguish between ADD and ADHD is the hyperactivity component, which is of ADHD, creates more of an issue with the expression of energy. So someone with ADD tends to go, it's more inwardly expressed, and that's why you don't notice the hyperactivity component. Usually, you find that people with ADD tend to be on the lines more introverted. They have more introverted traits. A little bit more seclusive. And someone with ADHD, they're outwardly express the issues. So therefore, someone with ADHD, you could make a conjecture that it's maybe easier to diagnose ADHD just because it's easier to view, or it's easier to detect. So, in terms of communication problems, these disorders, because the impulse, there's problems with the filtering of the mind, the ability to filter information correctly, or be able to control the impulses. There tends to be problems with the communication because you need to be able to control what is said, or and this is usually more so a problem with ADHD. They have issues with, because they tend to extrovert, or they go outward, and they can be more chaotic, and therefore creates, because depending on the severity, if one is to bounce around very frequently and hyper focus on the interest to such a high degree, it creates obliviousness, to the social cues, and this is why there's so much overlap. But in terms of high functioning autism and Asperger's, their communication issues, as a consequence of the problems with social intuition, or the ability to pick up on these signals that are should be fluid, should flow naturally. And when you're very young or you're a child, you pick up, you learn, you pick up on these social signals, and 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 what ends up happening is neurotypicals, the energy invested to actually make sense or to actually understand the social environment or the interplay between emotions, or all the social, or when to act in a certain way or how to act in certain situations or different scenarios. It basically, the energy approaches zero. It converges to zero because instinctually they pick up these cues, and therefore it's like an automated process. And because they don't need to have that extra processing, it's easier to get by, it's easier to socialize. But someone with Asperger's and autism, they need to exert so much energy to pick up on these signals. They have to do it analytically. So imagine how much processing goes into the equation, and therefore, and what's interesting is people with ADD and Asperger's, they both have executive functioning issues, problems with planning, prioritizing, organizing. And this is a huge issue with socialization, because if someone has to spend extra time processing that information, but they're also sensitive to the environment, which is a key distinction between one of the key distinctions between autism and ADHD. Although people with ADHD and the hyperactive spectrum can be very sensitive as well, so that's why they're, and that probably tends to have to do with their mind is externally focused, so therefore they're probably more could be they're focused more on a wide stream of external stimuli versus someone who goes inward. It may not be shown that way, but someone with Asperger's, they tend to have very severe reactions to the external environment, like noise. It could be just the amount of extra noise in the environment or stimuli. It can cause a lot of issues with people with autism and Asperger's. But the interesting thing is they tend to either have hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity. So it tends to be either one direction or the other. Some could be hyposensitive to pain, or very hypersensitive, or very hyposensitive to sounds, or very hypersensitive. So that's why it's very hard to distinguish between these disorders. But I find a key distinction is like someone with Asperger's, they have trouble with their issues has they have to do with the masking and trying to fit into a group by analytically approaching a social situation rather than instinctually. And that even someone with ADHD without Asperger's can still pick up. They can read people, but their issues stem from the impulse control, lack of impulse control, versus someone with Asperger's or autism, high functioning autism. They don't naturally do so, and therefore, if the stream of input is increasing or expanding, that's why it causes sensory shutdowns, because you're adding more information that is necessary to to perform or to process a certain social environment. And if you add on to that the sensory sensitivity, the threshold for mental shutdown is going to be approached more rapidly than otherwise if you didn't have to invest so much energy into social, reading these social cues. So that's a huge distinction. And also, people with Asperger's, they either tend to give too much eye contact or too little. And when it comes to too much eye contact, that's really, again, the hyperfocus issue. Both people with ADHD and Asperger's tend to have problems with hyperfocusing, but the difference is someone with Asperger's, they narrowly focus on a task. It's hard for them to switch between tasks, so they focus at a focal point in one particular area, and that's why people with autism have special interest. They're they have neurochemical differences or neurological differences where their brain is over amplified, or there's too much development in certain domains or certain areas. Someone who's neurotypical has a broader range of or development, but it may not be skewed to one side or overly skewed. So that's why people with Asperger's, if they could score very well in certain areas, they could be verbally adept, mathematically adept, or depending. And that's why anyone wants to gravitate towards interest. You gravitate towards interest because one, you get there, you gain, you progress at a faster rate, and secondly, the reward is therefore increased or progressed and pushed forward at a faster rate, and therefore you gain more satisfaction. You don't want to go towards something you're not as good at. It takes much longer to yield something positive. So therefore you tend to divert away. But people who are neurotypical tend to have broader interest because they have more, it's not as skewed in the intensity or their ability or expertise in a certain area. Someone with Asperger's have this huge hyper focus and they narrow in on that for hours and hours and hours. And that's the biggest distinction between hyperfocus between Asperger's and ADHD. ADHD, they tend to switch, or ADD, switch between multiple tasks because of lack of stimuli or impulse control and the ability to, and therefore it's causing more of a divergence of the mind. And that's one way you can, but of course you can have both disorders, which would add more, and it's actually pretty common to have Asperger's and ADHD combined, at least what they're finding. Partly that could be contributed to the commonality. There's definitely going to be propensity for misdiagnosis for cases, but it's clear, like with Asperger's autism, the social deficits are clear, or they're going to be there. There's going to be, you're going to have the sensitivity problems and narrow specific interests, and they like repetition. In other instances, people with Asperger's tend to have routines because they like repetition. The reason for repetition is for calming. It's to prevent, a lot of times there's something called stimming. Stimming is, it's like you need some stimulation in order to, calm down because you're so sensitive to multiple different inputs, and therefore you use a stimming to kind of just to ease the nervous system, because the nervous system tends to be over amplified, or it's overexerted in a lot of instances, and that's why people with Asperger's can kind of be lonely sometimes. They want to get out of certain environments, and therefore they stray away from social situations on a higher magnet or frequency. And yeah, this is the key problems. You tend to notice those on the spectrum who have the the stimming or the it's in and different different ways to deal with the sensitivities, and of course there's also going to be a lot of masking involved, usually with females who have Asperger's. So it's actually much harder to diagnose a female with Asperger's than a male, because women naturally are inclined to be in social situations or be more adept at social situations. And this is attributed to environment, at least I think, because depending on the traits that you have, the traits that you excel in, it really depends on where you situate yourself. So like back in the day when men used to do physical work or labor, construction work, and other tasks, and women back in the day used to stay home more often, take care of the kids, or I think there's this more propensity to be in a social situation or improve the social intelligence or social skills. And men, they were in different environments, and the deviance between environments dictates the differences between the social skills. And I find that women have an advantage typically on average. I find in that area, and they're more inclined, probably maybe to the social standards or what is expected, that could have some influence. But yeah, that women tend to have be better at masking than relative to men, and but it takes immense amount of energy to do so, and someone who has is more high functioning, it's going to be harder to detect, but the problems are always going to be there. It's just finding the ways to manage it over time and be able to situate yourself in social situations on a frequent basis, because if it's not done so, the social deficits are going to increase over time. Um, but either way, both disorder ADHD and also they both have the social deficit problem. But of course, with ADD and ADHD, you're going to find of a more of a scattering of interest, and they tend to bounce around a lot more, and hard for them to focus very long because of attention deficits. And you'll find their hyper focus is due to the need for high level stimuli, such as like a video game, on a continual basis. But either way, you'll notice when they play, their mind is still bouncing around to yield the highest reward possible. And someone with Asperger's will have similar hyperfocus, but it tends to be more of a state of flow rather than, a scattering of hyperfocus in multiple different areas. It's typically more narrowed. But yeah, that's just, how I view, the distinctions between the disorders. I obviously didn't list everything, um, but just through my experience, that's how I associate it. And yeah, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next time.